thank you all for coming. And I am at UC Davis and also affiliated with PACE. And there's so many friendly faces in the room of folks over the years I've interacted with. So thanks for coming. There are also lots of people in the room who know a lot about this topic. And so I'm counting on leaving a lot of time for Q&A. And the third thing is, as many of you have paid attention, this topic of collegiate remediation has blown up in policy and in the news in the last couple of weeks. So all this to say that Gary's going to keep me on time so that we leave lots of time for discussion and Q&A about next steps, which I'm just as eager to benefit from in terms of next steps for what researchers should be asking and what policymakers are seeking answers to. And so I just want to make sure we leave enough time for that. So he's going to cut me off. Okay. So what do I want to do today? I'm going to put just college remediation in the CSU context very briefly. And I'm going to talk in particular about the early start policy, which is now several years old. And we're going to do several things here. And I should have said, this is joint work with a graduate student of mine in economics, Lester Lesher, and Matthew Case, who's an institutional researcher at the CSU Chancellor's Office. This work, and in general, I should say, is after now almost a nearly decade-old sort of partnership, loose and formal sometimes, with funding between myself and the CSU Chancellor's Office in a variety of different projects, starting with the early assessment program. And so they have just been great partners and open to researchers coming in and doing some independent evaluation, and just very helpful with data questions. And Matthew's really been an active participant in this process. Okay, so we're going to ask three things of the policy. We're going to ask, first of all, we're going to look, the policy in particular left a lot for campuses to decipher. And so we're going to first look at the differences in the participation in the early start policy across campuses. We're going to look, and then we're going to estimate the effect of the actual policy, which was diffused across campuses. And we're going to ask, did it actually make a difference? And we're going to look at it separately for English and math. And we're going to look, did it make a difference on achievement, first term GPA, and on persistence rates, second year persistence rates and third year persistence rates. And then we're going to look at the effects of the actual placement signal under early start. So the difference between 2 and 3 is that we're going to ask first the question, did the policy make a difference? And then the second, or 3 up here, is going to be asking the question, did a student just at the cutoff of this, just being signaled to need remediation, who is sort of doing this in the early start regime period, that is a student in the last 3 years who was told they needed an early start, how do they compare to a student who didn't? And then we'll talk about some future directions. So just to set a little bit of the persistence and completion rates in context, and why many of us in the room are interested in this subject, is partly because of the sort of less than stellar persistence and completion rates that we see at CSU. Important to note, they have been improving, and I have to really applaud the CSU in general for their just continued efforts to address this and to improve time to degree, and to start having some really serious conversations about the achievement gap, or the persistence and completion gap in the system. That is, these rates, which I'm going to show you for remediation, look quite different by different racial ethnic groups. But it's important to note that overall we see that among students who start, less than 70%, actually less than 60% graduate in 6 years, and a very small number graduate in 4 years. These are what the graduation rates look like by race ethnicity. So what we also note is that the graduation rates for African American and Latino students are far behind white and Asian students overall. And you actually sort of see while despite overall increases in persistence and completion over the last 10 years, those gaps are not getting any smaller. And so this is an important area to address. I think. So this is going to show you the overall remediation. I'm about to show it to you by race ethnicity. This is the percent of students requiring some remediation, English or math, in the CSU system against that 6-year completion rate. And I'm going to really highlight in particular attention to this next slide, that the percent of students who are entering CSU ready varies very dramatically by race ethnicity. So in particular, the reason the reason we decided to focus so closely on early start and on remediation policies more generally is because remediation policies, when the racial disparities are so great in terms of college readiness, it's very important to take a close look at policies that disproportionately affect certain populations. And so we're particularly concerned with early start because it's not just the policy overall. The policy very much disproportionately affects students who are entering college deemed in need of remediation. And those students are often first-generation students. They're often students of color. And so in particular here, you'll see that African-American students, Mexican-American students, other Latino students have much higher, or much lower, this is college readiness, much lower rates of entering college ready than do other subgroups. And I should say all of these slides, for people who don't want to take, are all going to be available on the PACE website. So. Just to show you, again, to highlight the point of why we care about this policy and why we care about this broader, the impact of early start and of remediation for students and the CSU system. This is the first time freshmen by race ethnicity over time, and so what you'll see is much higher representation, in particular of Hispanic students. The numbers for whites are declining, and African American, the numbers for blacks is staying somewhat stagnant, but a little bit declining in the last 5 years. But in particular, you see this really large increase of Latino students in the CSU system. All right, so let's just put a little bit on of the controversy, if we will, over college remediation in context. So one of the reasons it's, and again, there's lots of folks in the room who will have contributed to this literature that I'm going to be describing, but one of the controversies or this question about collegiate remediation is where it should occur, right? So we know many students do need a bridge, right, who are entering college not ready, and so is it a bridge between K-12 schooling and college readiness? Is it the role of secondary schools? Or maybe community colleges, perhaps not four-year BA granting institutions. And so that has been sort of one of the big questions is where should remediation occur? And if it's, and I'm going to use remediation and developmental education more interchangeably. The CSU system tends to use the terms remediation at least most of the time. And so I'm going to use that. The other big aspect of the controversy is this notion of the cost, right? That it's expensive and that paying for remediation is often paying double, right? That we're paying in higher education for something that should have been taught in K-12. More recent, for a long time, many of us were using an old estimate. There's a pretty relatively recent study by the Center for American Progress that has the costs nationally, right? So this is not California specific, at $1.3 billion. If you're interested in the methodology of how they arrived at that, then I refer you to this report. But the other big reason, and why I think it's been in the policy debate in the last several weeks so much, is this notion of the poor outcomes of remediated students. And so I think while there's less controversy that students are perhaps lacking some developmental skills who are leaving our K-12 system and entering college, but there is a lot of evidence that those who do that, in fact, have poorer post-secondary outcomes. That is, the students who enter college not ready are less likely to succeed when they get there. So why remediation? Well, again, students enter college unprepared for college-level work. Well, why is that? Why do students potentially not have the skills who are admitted and entering college? Well, one is this notion of the variation in academic rigor in K-12, something I and others are thinking a lot about in terms of the new accountability system, right? So A to G may be a necessary but not sufficient condition. And so we often use more than just grades to get people into college and into sort of in admissions processes. So there's a lot of variation in what a course is called, what content students get in high school. We also know that students lack information about college readiness, and that includes more than just academics. That includes how to be successful in college, a whole host of other academic and non-academic skills. And then many have looked at this notion of post-secondary misalignment, Andrea Venezia being one of the primary people who's in the room, and this idea that it's misaligned partly we see as evidence in the fact that we see so many students based on our admissions policies needing remediation in the first place. That also is simply just evidence that they're misaligned, that they're getting this two different pieces of information. But also placement policies have suggested that our systems may be misaligned. And what do I mean by that? We now have studies from a variety of different states and some local kind of based studies of colleges that have placed students using other measures and who have fared quite well, skipping sort of remedial or developmental coursework, also suggesting, providing some evidence that perhaps our placement policies are also not in a way to truly measure college readiness skills. So why should we care? It's expensive, it's inefficient, right? The process itself adds some inefficiencies, but also definitely for students and their families. Discouraging, I'm going to say more about that on the next slide as well, I think, but basically there's a host of more qualitative research that has suggested that students, when they get this message, despite getting into a college that they are needing remediation, may be discouraged by that message. And that may take a toll on their performance. It may even take a toll on whether they decide to enroll in college in the first place and how they fare when they get there. Again, to this point, there are poor outcomes for students identified for remediation. That's, I think, the reason most of us care and why there's such policy discussion about it now, is that it's not just that it's a label of remediation, it's that those students aren't doing as well in our systems. And why I'm going to argue, and when I close today, is this aspect of inequality. It's, and that is, when we focus on remediation, we're also really having to address really deep inequalities we have in our system, and these policies, and who's identified for remediation is not random, and it is very systematically impacting certain students in our system. And there's a really important equity reason for why we should care about these policies. So I'm not going to go through all. There's lots of research actually on the subject, and if you kind of Google it, it's very robust right now. It wasn't 10 years ago, but I would say there's just so much now on the topic. So I'm going to kind of in bullets sort of give you the punchlines, right? So the first and foremost is that academic preparation matters. It's the single most important predictor of your success in college, right? So how rigorous of an academic experience you had in K-12. We also know from work I and Jake Jackson have done on EAP and others have done on alignment policies, that better articulated an alignment between K-12 and college expectations is effective. I have in the past done evaluation work on CSU's early assessment program, and we found that just giving information to students about their college readiness in 11th grade, when California was one of the first to do this, did lead to some modest but important reductions in remediation rates. And so we know that better efforts at alignment do work. And then importantly, in terms of does remediation work as a practice, that is, do students who are placed in remediation have better outcomes? This is perhaps the main reason we're questioning it, and I would say the answers are at best mixed, and that's generous. I would say there's actually more studies that suggest it is not effective than studies that suggest it is effective. But there are some that find positive effects, and so it's important for me to note that there is some mixed evidence on this topic. In most of these studies, what they do is they look at observably similar students, some who got placed into a remedial class and some who didn't, and try and track their outcomes down the road. We also know placement processes can be inaccurate, and again, that's from more recent studies in the last 5+ years that actually have taken advantage of actual experimental work and quasi-experimental work, looking at similar students who kind of skipped out of what they were assigned as in remedial courses and who have fared just fine without them. And also just from, sort of, I think the best study that I can think of on that subject is CCRC did this important, out of Columbia University, did an important study that sort of looked at how one of the main placement exams that was utilized for many years was not as effective at identifying students in need of remediation. And so we kind of, over time, have realized there is too many students being identified for remediation than who are probably in need of it. Finally, or not quite finally, but the second to last bullet there, remediation signal may be discouraging, again, from a variety of work, and I particularly like Jim Rosenbaum's out of Northwestern's work on this, that students, when they're given information about their lack of college readiness, may be discouraged, and then this can have a whole host of impacts on their performance and their behavior, their college enrollment behavior. And then last, this is not as close as of an area that I've looked at, but others have, and that is the different types of format and content of remediation. We know it matters, but we don't actually have some recipe of the best way it's done. We know more of the same doesn't work, right? Just more of the same, slower or louder is not necessarily effective for students, but we don't have a great body of literature that tells us this type of work, this type of developmental coursework or content or format work. I'll say a little bit, we've been trying to explore our results based on the different modality of instruction and early start, and I'll say something about that a little bit later. Okay, so to get us going with the data, I'm going to show you, this is what, this slide, basically, the punchline is something most of you know, which is that most of our students, when they are sort of still at the high school point, are deemed not prepared for college. And so, again, California was at the forefront of giving students this signal in 11th grade. Many states have followed suit in some form or another, but this notion we shouldn't wait till people are, sort of filling out applications or even enrolling in college to figure out what are the expectations of college. And so these are the EAP results from 2013 when we were still under the CST. And so here we'll see at that point math was you only participated in the math portion if you were at a certain level. And so you'll see here are the rates of students sort of ready, and they were very, very low. Conditionally ready gave us a few more, but in general we see that a great number of our students are, at least at the end of 11th grade, deemed not quite college, are not ready for college level work. This is based on the newest, the Smarter Balance assessments from the recent, thanks to our great collaboration, I'll say something about at the end, with CDE on this topic, which is the alignment between K-12 and higher ed in California more generally under our new Common Core standards. And so here again, you'll see that a great number of students are in that green of not met or nearly met. And so we have lots of reason to think that based on just our evidence from K-12 that students are not meeting the expectations, at least, that CSU and community colleges have set out about what it means to be college ready. Okay. This graph is not thanks to me, it's thanks to the CSU. Many of you may have seen it before. And it gives you students their pathway to college readiness. I confess that it wasn't as intuitive as I wanted it to be for me personally, but I get the communication effort. So there it says below are multiple ways to become CSU college ready. In particular, let me just highlight you to the fact that we can have a later conversation about what does multiple measures mean. But suffice to say that there are different ways that CSU will accept demonstrating your college readiness. And that EAP, or now under Smarter Balance, is only one way. And so you'll see, if we start with the blue, that your actual CASP, your EAP score, is one way. ACT, SAT, both the new and the old. AP class, there's a variety of ways you can demonstrate separately for English and math. And when you don't demonstrate it, you get sort of a trajectory. In particular, all of these goals of sort of demonstrating your readiness prevent you or exempt you from taking CSU's local homegrown placement tests, right? Called the EPT and ELM. I do not want to test on all the CSU acronyms. Between those and the CD and community college, I will definitely fail. So if I misspeak, feel free to correct me. But the EPT and ELM are the CSU's placement exams, and the goal of all of this to get there is to sort of exempt from those placement exams to begin with, to demonstrate that you are ready. And when you can't demonstrate, when you cannot exempt from them, you must take them, and then there is a cutoff. And when you don't meet that cutoff, then you are deemed needing remediation, right? And under the early start policy, which I'll get to in a second, you're deemed needing remediation and needing to start that remediation in the summer, okay? And so that's the general pathway. All right, so just a quick thing, and if this is our own efforts. I have a friend at College Board, I tried to get an official. I tried to look for this official. I've never seen it, maybe Pamela's seen it, but this is just my effort. I have always been curious if CSU's efforts to remediate, or efforts to declare college readiness using the national tests like the SAT and ACT were harder or more conservative than other states, and it turns out they are. Connie's in the room. I wonder if Connie knows this. Anyway, yeah. So I don't know if, yeah. So I've looked for a very long time for something official on this, and I've never found it. You looked as well, but.
I have found some that are at the same level
The same level. So what we did is we used iPads to get peer institutions, and then just sort of said, and there are many, and honestly, it's not that we picked out the ones that are not, it's more that we tried to pick ones that have both an SAT and where we could find information on their website. So these are all institutions, and so it's suffice to say, like, it's definitely not an easy threshold, right? Maybe it's not much harder than everyone else's, but it's definitely not an easy one, because there are others of peer institutions that use a different one. Okay, this is just another way, all those things on the last colorful graph. What's important is that students do use these multiple pathways. Many, as you saw from the early graph, are not deemed college ready in 11th grade, but then either retake ACT or take SAT in their first try or after, and through one of those other channels, demonstrate their college readiness. And so you see the biggest group is ready by exam of some form. That is CASP, AP, SAT, or ACT. That's the blue. And then the conditionally ready based on the 11th grade test is another big chunk. That is students who are given the message that they're nearly ready, right? So the nearly met and actually met standards on CASP allows students to then take a 12th grade course and to meet that exemption. So I think I kind of skipped over that, which is not it's pretty important. The conditionally ready, the yellow, which I skipped over, is a very important feature of California's efforts to better align. And it's a big feature of our future work, which is do in fact students who meet that conditionally ready signal take those courses in 12th grade. So here what we see is quite a chunk of students are meeting that effort to not to exempt out of those placement tests at CSU by satisfying that conditionally ready status. And then that green of ready by CSU exam, that's the ELM and EPT. That is students who didn't demonstrate through all these other channels. They show up at CSU or actually at their testing center in advance of arriving, and then they have to sit for that ELM and EPT. And many of them do cross that threshold and pass based on that, and that's the green. And then those who don't may satisfy by, again, they don't meet that threshold on ELM and EPT, and so they take an early start course or summer program, and there are others, doesn't just have to be early start. You'll see that's quite small, and then that yellow is students who still need to satisfy some developmental coursework. Even if some of those may have actually done early start as well, but then they're still not quite done with their developmental requirements. Okay, so just to remind you what early start is before we get into its impact, right? Early start began in 2012 with the stated goal of better preparing students in math and English before their first semester, thereby improving their chances of completing a college degree. So really important effort on the part of CSU to try to address these developmental needs, suggesting that perhaps a better way to do it is to think about using the summer. It is required for incoming students who have not fulfilled the entry-level math, ELM, or English placement test, EPT, proficiency requirements. So after all those other measures, if they take that test and they don't pass it. And so the stated program details are that the program takes place the summer before the freshman year. Upon admission, CSU campuses inform students how and where to sign up for early start. That information is, by the way, slightly different for every campus, and sometimes different by campus and subject. That is, sometimes the math, you get a separate, depending on whether you need it in math, English, or both. And early start math and English courses are available at every CSU campus, at least, or online. And there is some financial aid available for students who need it, in case you're wondering, well, how can students afford this, right? Okay, so what do we ask? Again, we're going to ask, how does early start, what does early start participation look like across the system? This was a really, when I went into this, I didn't realize how much freedom the CSU campuses had, and I think people like Joyce Helvetti at Sac State who've tried to educate me on some of this, that the differences by campus and how this gets implemented just means that when you see my overall effect, that I'm gonna make you sit and wait to tell you if it works or not. You have to keep that in mind. That is, what's wrapped up in our estimates is the fact that the policy has functioned differently in every campus, which will then, you'll say to me, so what does it look like by campus? And we're working on that, right? We didn't want to release these campus differences. So when you see an overall effect, keep in mind that it's partly driven by the fact that it's going to look really different in every campus. So we're going to ask, did the policy impact student success at CSU, performance and persistence? And then do students identified for remediation under early start have better achievement and persistence outcomes than otherwise similar students not identified for remediation? So we're going to use 6 cohorts of first-time freshman applicants, 3 years prior to early start, 3 years after early start. We're going to look at GPA in the first term, persistence to year 2, persistence to year 3. The units accumulation, we're trying to figure it out. There's a little bit of, I had some results for it, but we're going to hold off on it because we're trying to understand. It's really important we get it right, partly because of these conversations of the co-requisite courses, and so we're going to, we're not quite ready to, we're checking some things on it because it's not entirely clear how the measures for unit accumulation, if it's including early start, but they're not credit bearing. We just want to be able to give you a clear answer on that. And then we're going to have this remediation status, participation. We actually have information on the mode of participation, if it was 1 credit versus 3. If it was online versus face-to-face. So the first research question, okay, these are the campuses. I'm not going to identify them. Sorry if that disappoints you. This is the blue triangle is early start English, and the red circle is early start math. Keep in mind these are the participation rates by English and math, and keep in mind that each of those represents based on the denominator of who we have as needing to participate, right? So you can sort of think of it as compliance, but not really, because when I show you, and in fact I'm going to tell you, because I have it written down, all of the waivers and exceptions to participating, which might then explain why these are not 100%. So you can take a qualified community college course. You can take a summer bridge or similar type program at CSU. If you're not a California resident, if you're an international student, if in 12-13 there was this EPT range that was also a little fuzzy. So I have all these this is the benefit of partnering with the CSU Chancellor's Office institutional researchers, because they have this level of information that I often don't have. But here's my favorite one, local decision. So just keep in mind that once I saw that as a bullet, local decision. So just that's going to explain that a lot of this is really going to be up to the campuses and how they do it. Please.
Are these circles and triangles matched by campus?
Yeah, so that's right. So thank you for saying that. So each of these is a campus. Thank you. Feel free to ask clarifying questions because I know I speak fast. And so each of this is a campus. So right here, this is a campus. You don't know which one, but it's a campus where this is the participation rates. I'm sure there's a light on here. I don't have to touch the screen. Or maybe I do. So that's the participation rate in English, and then the one in the same vertical space is in math. Yeah.
So the denominator again are
students we have identified based on all of these processes should be an early start.
okay.
Okay.
Otherwise exempted from.
Yes, that's right. They took the ELM or EPT respectively. They did not meet the threshold. They should be an early start.
But I thought campuses were requiring students to do.
When I went into this, I thought that as well. Yes. Now, I read that list to you. Well, I read that list to you because partly this is when I showed this to CSU, they said, well, there are all these other ways that you can, right, yeah. So.
Is there information about the breakdown? You're just not showing us? Like, for example, the first column, you got about 60% of the students participating in early start English, but the rest of the 40% who didn't.
No,
Do you
so.
know how it's not, how they're not.
Oh, do I know what they did instead? Oh, no.
That's not available or just not going?
No, and it's actually, I'm not even sure it needs to be reported to the Chancellor's Office. I don't know, to answer your question, if they need to demonstrate that.
So in your, sorry, I don't.
No, it's okay.
Comparison breakdown would be those who didn't participate.
No, I'm not going to actually do it quite like that, but ask me that question again if I. Okay, this is mode of instruction. You'll see one campus missing. Just don't worry about it. So these are the emotive instruction for English, and 2014, the most recent year. Asynchronous, face-to-face, and synchronous. So you'll see there's also a lot, again, each of those vertical lines represent a campus. And of those who took, so again, now that's why it goes to 100%, of those who took, this is the modality that they took it in, right? So asynchronous, face-to-face, and synchronous. That was for English. This is for math. I'm going to go through a little more quickly with this because I know people want to look at the impact. This is unit. So you'll see the far majority of campuses, Early Start is a 1-unit Early Start English course, right? Or 1-ish units because it's not always exact. And then there's this blue, which is 3+, right? So and part of it is because some of these are attached to other summer programs. It's always so hard. It's not such a clear rule always. But yes, we decided to split them by 3 units and less than. And math, you do see many more students taking a more 3-unit version of math. All right, so let's just get to this comparison. We're going to use this method called difference and difference. I'm going to try my best to explain it without an equation. The intuition is we're going to ask, what would students who are deemed in need of remediations, what are the students' outcomes for students who are deemed in need of remediation look like if Early Start didn't exist? So the thought experiment in your head is we always had students who needed remediation versus those who didn't. And what we're going to ask is now for comparing students who live under this Early Start regime, is the difference in outcomes between remediated students and not remediated students any different than it would have been in the period when Early Start didn't exist? Okay? So actually, I'm going to skip these just to try to convince you that not much else has happened. We're going to control for those things anyway, but you don't see big changes in SAT or GPA. What you can see from this graph is that college-ready students, we're going to actually remove students who were deemed not even needing to test, right? So what we do think is that students who have to sit for the ELM and EPT are probably the best control group because people who remediated long in high school are quite different students. And so you'll see that with GPA, you really see it with SAT. So the blue line, the vertical line is just when Early Start came to be. And what you see here is that students who are college ready at entry look very different in terms of SAT than students who had to sit for the EPT. Right, so this is English. The green is they sat for the EPT and they didn't meet the threshold, so they need remediation. And the yellow is they sat for the EPT and they don't need remediation, right? And I can probably convince you that the blue is very different, right? These are students who didn't even sit for the EPT. Okay, so I'm going to spend a little time on this graph, which is going to be a picture of what if Early Start had no impact on achievement or persistence. So it's a hypothetical. What if Early Start had no effect? So let's think first about the y-axis. So the y-axis is just persistence to year 2. I could put other outcomes, right? And the x-axis you can think of as time, over time. And there's a pre-Early Start period and a post-Early Start period. And we're, again, only going to compare students within the EPT taking group. That is, we're not going to take students who are so observationally different, they were exempted from even taking the placement test. So we're going to think of 2 groups. The green is students who took the EPT or ELM. We're going to do this respectively for each group. And they needed a remediation. They didn't pass that threshold. And so we're going to think of them as a treatment group. They needed an Early Start. And then we have this yellow, which is they took the ELM and EPT and they passed that threshold. And so we're going to think of them as a control group. So notice the yellow's above the green because we might hypothesize, this is a hypothetical picture, that students who pass that ELM and EPT threshold have higher persistence rates, right? And we also note that over time, persistence rates has improved at CSU, which it has. And so we might just sort of see that there's over time other things going on. CSU is not exactly only doing Early Start. If you talk to any one of those kinds, there's many, many supports. There's tons of things going on at any given time. And many students are affected by all those great things that are going on at any given time. So we want to think about all those. Some of those things we observe as a researcher and we can control for, and other things we cannot control for. But what we do know is all of these students are experiencing it. And so what we see is in this hypothetical no effect, all students are improving. And those treatment students are not improving anymore, right? So it's not exactly drawn to scale, but both groups in this 6-year period that we're looking at are experiencing growth and at the same rate, right? In fact, we're kind of estimating hypothetically a 2 percentage point difference in persistence rate over time, just over time, which has nothing to do with early start. If early start did have a positive effect, what we might expect to see is that treatment group, that green line, increases at a higher, at a steeper slope, right? And so that's what we're going to look for. We're going to ask, using a pretty relatively simple equation, did students who were deemed in need of remediation in the early start period have an extra bump in their performance and persistence as a result, we're going to say as a result of early start. So what do we see? Let me just show you before I show the results, just what it looks like descriptively. This is year 2 persistence rate. So they do, what you do see is kind of what I implied in the last graph. We should have switched these, which is they are actually improving over time a little bit. Not necessarily in the years, though, exactly of early start. They're pretty high overall. The average 2-year persistence rate at CSU is pretty high. It's in the mid-80s. And you also see that students in need of remediation and who took the EPT are lower than those who took the EPT and do not need remediation, right? This is first term GPA. Again, you see kind of a relatively flat line in that period pre and post early start. And again, you see the same pattern that if you need remediation under EPT, your achievement is a little bit lower on first term GPA. Okay, so here are the results in pictures. The whole beauty of the difference in difference approach is that we can sort of say, this is the first term GPA. And what we see is that the students, so let's just look at the pre-period first. Can I get this? So it's like you don't see it once I get to the white. So I'm going to use my hands. Okay, so this is the pre-period. To the left, right, is the period before early start. And what we see is that, no surprise, students who took the EPT but who crossed, this is English, EPT, but who passed that threshold have higher first term GPA than those who took the EPT and did not pass it. And that's a difference. The difference is actually quite big in GPA units. It's 0.145, right? In the post period, we also see a difference, right? And that difference is 0.131. So in fact, we do see that the GPA, a positive effect of early start of 0.014. That difference is actually not statistically significant. So what we find is marginally and actually not statistically significant bump in GPA as a difference between treated students versus untreated students in the early start period. So it's very small and not statistically significant. What about second year persistence rates? Again, we see there's a difference in the second year persistence rates between students who are deemed ready versus deemed not ready, all of whom took that placement test. And the difference between those differences is 0.005. So very small and not statistically significant. There is some promise when you get to third year persistence rate. I would not hang policy changes on that, partly because we don't have as many cohorts, right, to have looked at. We really just have the 2. So this is the difference in the difference of third year persistence rates. And it's a 0.019, so about 2 percentage point difference in the third year persistence rates. Again, small, but this time statistically significant. Yes?
Statistically significant at what level?
We use 0.05 or, yeah. Actually, it's not 0.1 if you're, yeah, I use more conservative than the economists use, but yeah. All right, and this is first term GPA. So you might be worried. I'm going to say something on the next slide. We find a negative effect. So I'm only going to, for math, we only find this. I'm not going to show you the same plots in the interest of time where we don't find effect. But for math, we find a statistically significant negative effect for math on GPA. And I'm going to say something about why we think that might be. Do I show you? No, I don't show you. So we do not find, just to preview in the interest of slides, we do not find an effect on math for persistence rates. Second year, 2-year persistence rates or 3-year persistence rate, we only find this negative effect on. So why? Let me just say that because that's what you're probably alarmed at. Why the potential negative effect on GPA for math? One, and probably the primary reason, is if we think that students are satisfying those remediation needs in that summer program, it is distinctly plausible that that fall term they are taking either more units or harder units. That is distinctly possible. We are trying to, given the limited data at the Chancellor's Office, to try to decipher that. But that is one definitely possibility. I'll tell you just preemptively, looking at the units, it doesn't seem to be driven by more units. We're not necessarily finding it. Yeah, go ahead, Pam.
This is first semester GPA?
Yeah, just first term GPA. And so it is possible that the courses are, again, we're really trying to nail down, like, is it credit-bearing courses in the fall? And this is one where you're also really going to want to do more than just the policy effect. You're really going to want to try to nail the sort of treatment on treated, like among people who are actually, we see as definitely having participated in an early start program. So I'm not, in the same way I'm going to, now I will reveal my punchline since you've seen the results. I'm not going to hang the hat of policy reforms for remediation on early start. I don't think we've got enough evidence to suggest they've been, as currently implemented at a policy, successful. I'm also, not suggesting we're harming students either necessarily with this one result, negative result in math. So we could talk more about that. So interpreting these results, no consistently positive effect of the early start policy. It's really important that we nail that it's that what I am estimating here is the impact of the policy. And as you saw, that policy is interpreted very differently across the campuses. And so you can't think of it as being interpreting the impact of a kid getting early start, because we don't necessarily know that. I'm going to show you results to that direction in just a minute. But right now, what you're estimating is the impact of the policy. To me, it's still a really important question that policymakers should care about, because we implement it in this way, meaning CSU gave the freedom to campuses to do it in different ways. And so they deserve, or we all deserve to know what happened when you do that, right? And that was the case with EAP as well. There was some voluntary aspect, and it was really important to sort of see when it is voluntary, what do you see? And as it became clear that it was important, I think more schools participated. Yeah.
I had a theory about your math difference that you
Okay. Do you want to save it just because I'm in the interest of time to hang? I'll try and finish in a second, but I would love to hear your theory about the math one. Okay. So I also just want to quickly show you that the campus difference is another way to think about it, which is campuses across the system are serving very different types of students. And so this is the rates of people even taking the ELM and EPT. And so some campuses, nearly half of all students, or a third at least, are showing up having not met all those exemption pathways, right? And so this I am showing the campuses, right? So this is just to show you the types of students these campuses are serving. And in many ways, they are a reflection of the inequalities in K-12 system, right? That then these campuses, the receiving campuses are getting, right? And so, and there's really some stark, I think, kind of when you start look at some of the regions, and it becomes really important to think about the sort of distribution of opportunity in our state, I think. So here are taking AEPT and ELM across the system, and then less but still important variation once they take it, the percent who pass, right? So even though you see differential take rates across the campus, you're also seeing once they take them, differences by who's passing. So this is across campus. I know you guys are staring. All these slides will be available, and I have way too much packed in for one talk, I'm aware. Okay, so I just want to get at the last question, because I know it's really interesting to people, is the impact of the actual placement notification, right? So again, what we're going to think about here is how might the remediation signal. So again, it's not necessarily participating in, but it's really the signal of being told, based on your results of ELM or EPT, that you need remediation. And so we might think there's a discouragement factor there, right? That students may be discouraged by being told they need to do early start. And I had it in here and I pulled it out, but you can see there's lots of communication material that is provided to the campuses that they adapt around how they give this information and what they tell students about their options for satisfying early start. And so I'm not suggesting it, this is not a discourse analysis of that text or something, but we might think that just being told more generally that you need to do this in the summer may be a discouraging factor for students, especially keep in mind that CSU students are 3.2 students. I mean, these are by all standards sort of successful students who've done everything they needed to enter a 4-year college. And then they're told, actually, you're not quite ready and you need to take this summer class. Students may be discouraged about the demands of college from actually participating, right? So we can't disentangle those, the discouragement effect from just the signal versus then those who sat and did early start, sitting and doing early start, give them information about the demands of college that could be positive on the right, but it could also be potentially negative if they're struggling in that class, right? It could actually encourage, you could do that, be excited to start college in the summer, actually learn some stuff from the early start class, which I believe there's an important effort to try and actually address those developmental needs. And you might actually obtain social skills or other information about the college experience that may come about from summer programs. And it's important for me to say that even though this study doesn't look at that, I think there are lots of folks in the CSU system, whether it's through Early Start or other Summer Bridge or the San Bernardino model, I forget the name of it, what's it called? The Coyote program, right? There's models in the CSU system that are heavily invested in to give a really positive summer experience. We actually have other evidence from Summer Bridge program and others that summer could be a very important time to utilize to build students' academic and non-academic skills for college success. So for this analysis, I'll spare you all the details. We're going to use this method called regression discontinuity, and that is, we're going to think about students who are just below and just above that ELM and EPT cutoff. Why is that useful? Well, because if we think of students who are, really low achievers on the EPT, they're really different than those who just didn't do all those other things along that pathway and now have to sit for the EPT, but they're going to really easily pass it. But we might think of students just at the cutoff, which I've normalized here to 0, as being they might have just had a bad day and just didn't answer that one question, or a really good day and just did. And so we might think of students as just around that cutoff as pretty similar, but for some measurement error in the test. And only those who crossed the threshold were told they didn't have to do early start, and those who didn't were told they have to do early start. So hypothetically, this is the difference we might expect if you get that boost of being told you don't have to take early start. Again, hypothetical, we might think you'd have a higher GPA. You didn't have to sit for early start. There's a lot of things we don't observe mechanisms about why you might get that boost, but maybe you did hypothetically, and so you'd have a higher GPA. You can also think of this in the exact reverse. You didn't get that boost because you were told you have to take early start, and that depressed your performance, right? So you can think about it as the boost of getting on the right side of the threshold, or the sort of penalty of being on the left, right? In the same graph. What do we find? Nothing. We don't actually find the impact of the signal made a difference on your first term GPA. So, for what it's worth, very similar students who got this, let's think of it in a negative signal, it didn't seem to penalize them in terms of their GPA, or students who got this positive signal that they don't have to sit for early, they don't have to do early start, it didn't seem to boost them either, okay? We don't find much for persistence. It looks like a negative, like actually, in the opposite direction, but it's a 0. And the reason it's all noisy over here on the left is because we just have fewer students who are scoring that low on the EPT. So we don't actually find an effect on persistence rates as well. So last bit of slides here, then we'll open it up. Yeah, math is tricky for a variety of reasons. We're trying to, I don't like to show preliminary stuff because people tweet and do whatever, so I only show stuff that I've done like 8,000 times in lots of different ways, and I get the same results. So math we're still ironing it out, I know. I really wanted it to be ready, but there's just some stuff that we're going back and forth on. Early start as a CSU-wide policy effort has not resulted in significant improvements in performance or persistence of students identified in need of remediation. There's some evidence of modest improvements in third-year persistence rates in English, about 2 percentage points overall, but not in math. There are important differences in campus implementation of the policy that have to be addressed. And by that I mean, this is the impact of the policy overall, but when I show you how different the campuses function, what it naturally suggests is that we really need to think about the impact of the policy by campus, which we are working on. Importantly, the signal for early start remediation in English does not result in higher or lower academic performance or persistence. So We believe, or this is part, again, this is now my shout out to this new work we're doing, the California Department of Ed, to look at that signal students get in 11th grade and think about what does the signal of college readiness look like now in our era of Common Core, and how do students make sense of it? And importantly, how are schools taking advantage of these 12th grade? So there's just so much innovation right now happening in California around 12th grade course taking. So we think improving K-12 alignment with post-secondary education is a critical equity issue. And again, that's because this isn't just the impacts of these policies are not felt evenly by all students. They're disproportionately impacting particular students, and often students who are students of color, are underrepresented students, and students who are in high schools that have less academic rigor. And so this, the impact, the sort of double or triple impact they get by also entering college and being at a deficit is one that we have to, I think, importantly address. So that is strengthening evaluating efforts and better preparation in high school. There are several people in the room who are doing really innovative work on this work in math. Joyce Salvetti's team doing in 12th grade math work to satisfy the conditional exemption in math, and to just work with both community colleges and K-12 to improve math readiness. ERWC, the expository reading and writing course, all of these things need to be looked at, and also in terms of the availability for students to meet these. Are they being, when College Board for a long time tried very hard to make sure that AP was offered across our, there wasn't inequalities in who gets access to AP, and I think we equally, or maybe even more importantly, to address that these types of courses that bridge that conditional exemption are really distributed evenly across the state, and that our teachers who are serving students who are likely to end up in these categories are being trained by these latest methods. So strengthening the transition and developmental supports in college. So that was all, the first bullet is all pre-college, where I'm going to hang my hat. When a reporter asked me yesterday, I was like, I'm hanging my hat on the need to better align to improve the connection with K-12. But colleges are always still going to face students who, even despite all our better efforts to better align our systems, are going to have some developmental needs. And so those are important, and I think those are also critical equity issues, because as long as we have these placement tests, often of which are high stakes, and we have lots of research that suggests that our students of color and other students may experience those tests differently, right, may have other stressors attached to their performance on that test. We need to be thinking about multiple measures to address. We need to think of co-requisite classes, other things that have all been in the news in the last couple weeks. They just beat me to the punch. No, people have been saying this for a long time. So closer investigation of campus differences and the move to credit-bearing developmental education. Luckily, I didn't have to be, someone said to me, oh, is it hard to be the bearer of bad news? I said, no, because it turns out the CSU has been thinking about all of this at the same time I was, and so they, not the institutional researchers, the leadership, just in their March meeting, many people in the room have followed this, had an important effort to, and they very explicitly, if you look at those board meetings, to talk about improving systems, policies, and programs, specifically promoting 4 years of high school math quantitative reasoning, improving placement assessment, strengthening early start. They may not want to talk to me about that. That could look different ways. I think they have the data to basically look closely at where it might be working and where it might need some improvements, and I'm going to happily collaborate with them on that. And then this notion of restructuring developmental ed. So they've been saying all this, and I'm actually going to end with this great quote that the Executive Vice Chancellor for Academic and Student Affairs says, and I couldn't agree more, remedial courses represent strike one before they ever set foot on any of our campuses. It represents a deficit model that must be reformed if we really hope to achieve our equity and completion goals. And so I will end there, so hopefully leaving us some time for questions. And just my caveats is this work was funded by IES and does not represent, even though Matt Case is a collaborator, does not represent the opinions of IES or of CSU more generally. So I'll stop there, and hopefully we can have a discussion. Thank you.